I affirm the resolution that junk food should not be allowed in schools. Just some definitions so that we're on the same page. Schools is going to refer to, of course, elementary, middle, and high schools. Junk food is defined by Oxford as prepackaged food that has low nutritional value. Now, the way we make any decision in the schools, the obvious focus is on what's best for kids. I mean, kids are the whole reason we have an education system to begin with. We care about the next generation. So this is how we're going to make our decision. Is having junk food in schools best for kids or not best for kids? I'm going to give you two justifications or reasons why junk food should not be allowed in schools. The first one is it's harming health. Now, many of us know the deleterious effects of obesity. It's the #2 cause of preventable death in the United States, according to the National Institute of Health. And it's obvious a huge killer. It takes out 300,000 people every single year. Now, the contribution of the availability of junk food to obesity is well documented. The Bureau of Economic Research published a report that in the decade of 1995 to 2005, they documented the increase in BMI and obesity. At least a fifth of that was directly tied to the availability of junk food in public schools. So it's not merely that people make bad decisions at home. Sure, they do. And my opponent's probably going to point out that there are other issues. I couldn't agree more. But the issue is that this is a contributing factor that makes the problems of BMI and obesity worse for children, which is the whole thing that we're trying to avoid. Remember, too, that this has far-reaching effects. It's not just bad for the individual, but it's also bad for the parent. We're talking about ballooning healthcare costs. We're even talking about lower standardized test scores. When you're eating poison every day, you don't get the essential zinc, B vitamins, omega-3 fatty acids that you need to have basic cognitive development. So your life, your test scores, your family, everything's worse. And the only person that benefits, this is so crucial, is the company selling them. This is what we talk about in justification 2 of vulture marketing. Now, it's well documented, too, that companies that sell Cokes or candy bars always market to children because they want them addicted early on. It's why the APA documents how they spend $12 billion annually just reaching the youth market, especially through something known as pouring rights contracts, which are where one institution, like some food corporation, will make a contract with the school, usually worth tens of billions of dollars, to only sell their products at that school. These kinds of effects are devastating. Marian Nestle has a master's in public health from UC Berkeley, and she talks about how insane it is that kids, this is in her book, Food Politics, she writes how it makes no sense for kids to learn proper nutrition in schools and then walk out and be bombarded by marketing from corporations designated to feed them poison. So here's the obvious argument. Vulture marketing and corporations designated on a profit incentive shouldn't be deciding the health benefits and the health decisions of children. Let's give them actual food and not force poison down their throats as they try to learn and study.
Well, thank you very much. Just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, just so I know we're good. All right, great. Okay, so I'm going to concede almost the entirety of your speech. Junk food is bad for kids. Junk food is not a good thing that kids should have, and junk food has far-reaching and negative effects on cognitive development and child psychology. I'm going to contest your framework. It shouldn't be decided on whether junk food is good or bad, mostly because that's not the resolution. The resolution says junk food should be banned in schools. Junk food should not be allowed in schools. I will contest that junk food should be allowed in schools simply because banning junk food from schools is not the most effective way to mitigate the deleterious effects that you most accurately point out. I'm going to come from this from three angles. One is individual psychology, the other is social psychology, and the third is going to be health, and then I'm going to give a counterproposal. On individual psychology dictates actually that banning things almost generally makes them such that they will enhance and supercharge those effects. For example, Dr. Jane McCartney is a psychologist who writes in the Daily Mail often about how Great Britain, Australia, and other countries put harsh regulations on things, and actually writes an article as of August 12th of 2016 about how banning junk foods in school would actually make kids fatter for two reasons. Well, from one main reason. The things that we're addicted to, like alcohol and cigarettes and junk foods like sugar, they activate the same part of the brain that breaking the rules and being kind of sneaky about it does. So there's a supercharge effect when we ban things that are addictive. It makes it more addicting to break the rules. This goes into my second contention, the social psychology argument. The social psychology argument, alcoholism was the highest as an epidemic in this country during the time of abstinence, when people could not drink alcohol. When when cities started cracking down on regulations of cigarettes before the Truth campaign, that's when cigarettes were smoked the most. It's after the Truth campaign, after really getting into people's psyche, that's when it started to go down, not because of laws. The third is the health argument. Your proposition would make health worse. The Pediatrics Journal does a study of in August of 2016 that showed that as of 2014, when Obama instituted a lot of these like harsh regulations on schools, 42% of kids were had overweight rates below 7th grade in schools with regulations compared to 36% without regulations. This proves the point of health actually being negative due to your idea. So my counter proposal would be, and I'll get to this more in my second speech, make healthy foods in school cheaper. That's why we should not ban junk food in schools.
Okay, so primarily, you mentioned social psychology and health, but most of his arguments are tagged under the issue of individual psychology. I'm going to have 3 individual responses to his argument. The overarching response is generic versus specific. Now, my opponent's making a basic black market argument, saying that when you ban stuff, you actually increase its access. This is generically something we would consider to be true. For example, a statement like "better safe than sorry." It's something that we could accept. On some cases, it's generically true, but when you apply it to specific scenarios, it's probably not as good idea. You might say, well, I don't know if I should lie to these Nazis about Jews in my basement, better safe than sorry. Obviously, there are scenarios where that idiom and that statement has no application whatsoever, and this is exactly what my opponent's done. Now, I commend my opponent for being well-researched and going through this. The problem is he's relying, off of predictions of what people say might happen when we actually have statistics. I'm going to give you 3 documented examples. The first is from the Journal of the American Dietetic Association from volume 108, issue 9. They actually document how soft drink consumption actually does go up with availability. I will point out we have had the access to actually measure this through empirics, because we have seen a ban in certain states like Massachusetts, which is what we'll talk about, as well as a non-ban, before they instituted it. So this isn't something we can just take my opponent's professor like, well, hey, maybe this will actually make it worse. We don't need that. We actually have empirics to know whether or not this will happen. The Journal of the American Dietetic Association already proves that it actually does. So my opponent's argument about how less availability means it'll go up is false. Availability increases. Remember too, the way that these kids get addicted is not by it's not like they ban them and these kids are scratching their arms like, I need a soda, I'm gonna buy one outside. No, if it's available to them and you increase the availability, people are gonna buy it more. The second is my argument from the Bureau of Economic Research. They already talk about how 1/5 of the increase of obesity from 1995 to 2005, they already attribute that to this. So my opponent saying that less of it will actually increase it isn't true. We've already documented that having it there actually increases it. And finally is a study from Northwestern University. They talked about the degree to which healthy food was available in schools. They found that the state of Massachusetts, before their ban, only 13% of their foods in vending machines had, actually met FDA guidelines. After that, after the ban, healthy food replaced them, and it went up to 69%. So let's respond to my opponent's last argument. He says, well, the solution is actually to make healthy food cheaper. My big response to this is pouring rights contracts. Once you don't ban them, the pouring rights contracts step in, they exclude all other competition, and they make it inaccessible. So my opponent's trying to say, well, yeah, no, keep them around, but just, kind of make the other kind accessible too. First, my side is all for making it accessible. It's just for getting the poison out of your system so you can get the kale and the vegetables in later. If my opponent leaves that open-ended and allows them to be in schools, we know the empirics, we know that it will actually increase obesity, and we know the pouring rights contracts will close out other competition.
Thank you. So we're both citing a lot of studies, so I'm going to try and kind of keep the framework a little high level here. You didn't disagree with my framework, right? So my framework for how we should judge this debate is whose proposal has more efficacy in solving for the negative cost of junk food. Yours is to ban them in schools, right? And mine is to make healthy food cheaper. You're trying to kind of permute both, which I think with the resolution that's this simple is fairly abusive, and that you're kind of assuming that that's going to happen. I'm going to say that that's wrong for a couple of reasons. First, you haven't contested my pediatric study, which is not just prescriptive, but descriptive of your case and fairly damning here. I'm going to cite it again. The pediatric study in 2014, as a result of President Obama's and Michelle Obama's initiatives on choice schools that instituted food regulations, showed that in schools with harsh regulations where they took junk food away, the overweight rate was 42%. In schools where they didn't, it was 36%. That means schools with freedom of food choice had a less overweight rate than schools that didn't. That is an empirical, 3-year-old, case-specific academic study that highly negates your claim. Now, you kind of said like, oh, it's generic to say that access makes it like this, except that's not true, right? Alcohol, cigarettes, and sugar all do the same thing. It's not generic at all. It's actually fairly it's fairly specific. And I'm going to go back to the psychology study. When you consume addictive substances, whatever they may be, alcohol, nicotine, sugars, what happens is it accelerates the absorption of amino acids that converts in our brain to serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter that makes us feel good. So for example, if you're depressed and you drink, it gives you a little bit of lift and then it messes you up. Sugar is the same way. If you're feeling down, comfort eating is a way of giving yourself a lift, and sugar is basically the crack cocaine of comfort eating, especially in under 18-year-olds. What happens when you do, now psychologically, this is neuropsychology, when you ban things, when you make them not allowed, and this is the reason alcoholism was its highest during Prohibition. It's the reason that smoking was its highest when they started cracking down initially before the Truth Campaign. Before you made it an organic change and you just try to institute laws, alcohol and nicotine use were their highest when we tried to ban them. That's because neuropsychologically, banning something accesses the same serotonin that actually acts as an enhancer. So it's a double addiction when you try to ban something without providing reasons for it. Now, when you make healthy foods cheaper and provide education in schools, then organically kids will start eating healthier. Whereas in your case, if you just ban them without any context, without education, without a specific way to insert healthy foods at a cheaper rate to provide choice. Choice is very important.
Yeah, your time went up. It's okay. Yeah, I appreciate your arguments here. First, in the framework of efficacy, we're all talking about, the best policy that is ultimately going to be best for kids. So there's only a theoretical conflict with framework, which isn't real. I'm still going to make the argument, even if you want to pretend that there's a conflict here, I'm still going to say that my policy has more efficacy for 2 reasons. First, my opponent never addresses the issue of pouring rights. You're literally looking at an opponent who's saying, yep, I believe it provides more efficacy to continue to allow companies to offer pouring rights contracts and close out all competition. How can my opponent say make healthy food cheaper when healthy food isn't even available at schools? You can't get it in a vending machine because of the pouring rights contracts. This is the essential link that's going to close out all efficacy on my opponent's argument. He still hasn't answered it. Okay, let's move down to his argument about making healthy food cheaper. And now he talks about the study from being, the kids being overweight. My big response here is of increase versus stasis. In other words, what my studies are analyzing, and the reason they're better are they're analyzing the increase in BMI as a direct result of that food being available. Now, what my opponent's looking at is he's saying, okay, after they pass this policy, look at the kids who are currently overweight in schools. Has that number changed or not? The 36% study that he presented out. Now, again, I do appreciate my opponent being well-researched here, but this evidence is just bad. Look, you can't analyze what percent of people are overweight 3 years later to know whether or not your policy is going to be better or not. What I mean by that is your overweightness doesn't immediately end when you stop the policy. So there's a couple of other reasons why this might not have happened yet. First is it takes a long time. The second is we could say that children are still eating unhealthy at home. Just because some kids are overweight, that's a correlation versus causation. We don't see a direct link there. Whereas all of my studies, the ones that precisely identify the availability of junk food, are actually making the argument that it does increase BMI. So even though there's maybe a couple examples here and there where kids were still overweight afterward, or a couple of them were more, there's external factors that can contribute to that. The second response is this is outweighed by all the other empirics. First, the Journal of the American Dietetic Association already talks about how soft drink consumption does go up with availability. Also, the Bureau of the Economic Research that we talked about earlier directly contributes 1/5 of the increase in BMI and obesity to the availability of junk food, as well as Northwestern University. Northwestern University, we have empirics here. It's already worked. Once we banned junk food, remember Efficacy, what my opponent talks about? They talk about how the unhealthy food in vending machines went from 13% meeting FDA guidelines to 69%. By the way, in high schools, the number went from 19% to 80%. So we've already seen efficacy on this policy. My opponent's vague predictions aren't really that important. Lastly, his argument about addiction and serotonin. Look, if we were just stripping away all sugar, that makes sense. Kids can still get some sugar. There's sugar in apples. There's sugar in granola bars. We're not hacking them off to where they're going to be some addict running out in the middle of the street with needles looking for their fix. That's not what's happening. All we're doing is getting rid of the poison, the pouring rights contracts that prevent their availability of healthy foods so they can start getting the stuff they actually need.
Great, thank you. You're dealing in the economics of what's going to happen post-plan, as well as basically trying to negate an empirical, accurate study having to do directly with the resolution with negative causation, which I don't think is really working here, right? So let's unpack that a little bit. You're saying junk food should not be allowed in schools. I'm saying two things. One, in the history of social progress, banning something has always made it worse. Alcohol, cigarettes, junk food, sugars. Every time we ban a massively consumed, massively addicted, universally liked product, that product proliferates and gets worse. You're talking about like rabid zombie kids going out in the street. That's not how that works, dude. They're going to put some Rice Krispie treats in their backpack and whatever else that they need to. There isn't going to be like checks at the school. They're just going to bring a ton from home. They're going to bring a ton elsewhere. Now, let's talk about this study for a little bit, because I think you're trying to sweep it under the rug, which I understand why, but let's not, right? So this isn't about like, oh, how could you not be fatter 3 years later? That's just not true. The Pediatrics Journal study was very accurate in outlining. It studied the BMI index and obesity rate of over 20,000 kids evenly from schools that instituted junk food regulations and schools that did not. 3 years after, no, 3 and almost 4 years after a policy passed about regulations on schools, what it showed definitively, without a shadow of a doubt, is that when they banned junk food in schools, kids got fatter. More kids got fat and stayed fat. Whereas in schools where they did not, but pushed Michelle Obama's health initiative of education and providing alternatives, those kids got not as fat. Like, that's as simple as it gets. When you push education and provide alternatives and a choice, generally health gets better. When you ban things, kids get not healthier. Now, that's why your Northwestern study and all your studies support my argument. If junk food in schools contributes to 1/5 of BMI, and if availability without alternative creates more overweight and more and a more proliferated lack of health, for example, that's why education and providing alternatives, not replacement, not banning, but alternatives, works better, as my pediatric study points out. That's pretty definitive here. And I think at this point, if the resolution is junk food should not be allowed in schools, and we're arguing over the framework of what's more effective, I think definitively we can say that not banning them due to proven social psychology and health statistics should mean that we should provide alternatives so the kids feel like they have a choice. They won't feel like they're going secret under the table. And we should provide education. Banning them will make the problem inherently, definitively, empirically worse.
Okay, let's group all of these arguments together. So my argument about how bans always make something worse is ridiculous. Okay, murder is banned. Murder would not be better if we made it legal. Heroin is banned. More people wouldn't be doing heroin right now as opposed to if it was legal. The reason is something like legal restriction is a decrease on incentive. We don't want to get caught, so we don't do it. In this case, we're not. The argument is that we don't allow its sale in schools. The availability of something always increases its use and its access. Now, I'm not saying there's never exceptions. Like alcohol is a good example of how it kind of got out of control. We're talking about kids in school. Is my opponent really going to say that more junk food will be consumed in schools when you remove the vending machines that house the actual junk food? It's completely non-intuitive. My opponent's generic argument about how sometimes, we can see an increase in use once we ban something is not true. Look at murder, look at heroin, look at, a million things. There isn't one simple reaction to the ban of all things that describes it. My opponent's being oversimplistic with statistics here. Here's what we do know. My opponent is relying on one individual study that looks at the correlation between weight in children at school and a previous ban. So I want you to remember two key arguments here. The first is the specificity of links. My opponent's saying, here's a ban here. 3 years later, here's where the kids are. Now, I understand that this study is persuasive. My opponent likes it, but it is, at its best, still correlation. Now, he could argue and say that correlation matters. It makes sense if I had counter correlation, but I don't. I have actual specific documented links about how on a national average, the increase in BMI is due, at least a fifth of it, to the availability of junk food in schools. That's not simply saying kids kind of looked fatter, I guess, in the future, so I guess it was, I don't know. We're saying directly we know that that availability increases. The second argument is availability increases use. Ask yourself this question. Are kids going to be eating more junk food when they can get it for 25 cents from a vending machine, or from when they have to go out before school, find a store, walk in, put it in their backpack, walk it back out again, then get into the school, then pull it out of their backpack and eat it? Are we seriously going to say that increasing the difficulty of getting junk food is somehow going to make the problem with it worse? That's ridiculous. My last and final argument you can write out as wash your hands. Look, even if my opponent's whole argument about it sometimes being worse than a few examples were there, the school should not at all be funding this problem. They should not be readily providing sweets and junk food to kids who spend their time in school learning nutrition and then walk out being bombarded with the vulture marketing of pouring rights contracts, with the marketing of forcing kids to, or not forcing, encouraging kids to destroy their bodies at a young age. This should not be the result. I'm willing to concede that there are some statistical variances, as is true with anything, but look at the weight of evidence. We have documented details from Northwestern, we have professionals, we have people with masters in health education from Berkeley versus one correlation.
So a couple of things. After Michelle Obama passed her initiative, the thing that the pediatric study was cited on, within a year, there were 1,860,000 hashtags of hashtag bring back our snacks from kids under 9th grade, which is why the Obama administration and the White House banned this policy and went back on it. Because the empirics are right, and it's not statistical variance. And you're using a lot of big debate jargony words, which I appreciate. I'm a debate coach, but it's just not true. Right? So let's look at that for a little bit. You compared sugary things to murder and heroin. But when you listen to the tape again, you'll hear what I said. Things that, let's go back to my exact wording. Things that are massively consumed and massively addicted and embedded in society cannot be banned. Murder isn't, heroin isn't. But alcohol, nicotine, marijuana, sugar, these are substances that are embedded into the culture. When you ban them, you make them worse. Things that are things for outliers. Not everybody wants to murder, right? Our serotonin isn't produced when a normal human being with normal psychology murders, right? But sugar, alcohol, and nicotine all have these effects. You're saying it's statistical variance and it's a broad study. I'm referring to our brains. I feel like you're kind of negating general neurobiology here, right? Addiction of sugar, alcohol, and nicotine are embedded into our cerebellum that actually is part of how we calm down. It's how kids deal with stress. They have sugar. So if you're saying, how could they just bring snacks from a home? That's insanity. Well, they do, and they did. They did. They absolutely did. That pediatric study that studied 20,000 kids with schools that have regulations and with schools that don't have those regulations definitively showed that when you ban something, it gets worse. It made them fatter. It made them less healthy, which is why my plan, my counter proposal of why, and this is what the Obama White House decided on, Michelle Obama decided on it. Most of the health industry has decided on this, which is why we haven't seen bans. Mayor Bill de Blasio instituted this in one of the school districts in New York. Right here in the LAUSD where I live, we've instituted this policy. I sat in on the conversations during the Los Angeles City Council when this was decided. Education and healthy alternatives were decided as the better way to do this because the science shows that it has more of an effective rate on making kids healthier because bans make them less healthy. That's why some of the major cities, as well as the most intelligent White House we've seen in a bit, decided on these policies and not yours. And that's why I think that this resolution definitively flows con. Thank you very much for your time. Good debating with you.
Still have 3 minutes and 10 seconds. I'm going to wrap this up very. So a lot of the disagreement in the round has been unnecessary because I'm realizing my opponent is not simply arguing for allowing them to be there. He's arguing for essentially the same thing I am. He wants kids to be healthier. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the argument my opponent has continually made about education and I'm going to use that against him. Look, my opponent has said that banning them, sometimes makes it worse. And I'm willing to concede that in certain select areas, kids, we may not have seen immediate effect after that. That's not the reason to give up on banning them, and here's why. You can do all three. Voting for this side of the resolution doesn't mean this is the only thing you do with schools, that you only ban them and you do nothing else. Of course, it's a problem that kids are learning good nutrition in the classroom and walking out 5 minutes later to eat a Twinkie. That's an issue. My argument would be this, the one that I made early on, that you can do all of these things. You can give them good education, you can provide them healthy alternatives, and you can ban the food. Now, I want to specifically address the last thing my opponent said about the study. He said the issue was kids got fatter because, they were deprived of this. He's made a lot of psychological reference that I appreciate as well. Here's the thing. You can still get healthy sugar. You can eat apples, you can eat granola bars, you can eat trail mix. There are ways to still satisfy the basic craving for simple carbohydrates and sugars to get the serotonin release your neurotransmitters so desperately want. So the argument in this debate round is actually incredibly simple. Should we pretend to give healthy alternatives, which, by the way, are still impossible when you vote con, because guess what? Pouring rights contracts are still a thing, and my opponent has made no argument about economically why they'll disappear. So are we going to either pretend that we can do that and still keep them available and, somehow lower the price of healthy food, or are we going to do the sensible thing? Get the poison out, get healthy alternatives in that still satisfy the basic sugar craving, and educate kids, as we continue to do, on what basic nutrition looks like. I think your decision's easy.
Thank you very much. Let's some top level framing. So as the last half hour's unfolded, you've kind of conceded more and more ground until now you're just like, well, yeah, he's right. Let's do all of them. Except that's not how debate works, right? The framework at the top of the resolution was very clear. If you go back to our first two speeches, you're advocating for a flat out ban, and I counter propose an alternative, which is education and healthy alternatives, with a caveat that banning actually makes it worse. So either you believe my counter proposal in and of itself, or even if you don't, you're still conceding that banning them flat out makes them worse. So let's talk about it a little bit. Because if the affirmative could always just say, well, yeah, let's do all that stuff, they'd win every debate. That's inherent affirmative bias, which I know you know because you teach debate. So let's not do that, right? Let's say you're arguing for a ban, and I'm saying let's not. Your pouring rights contract have been definitively kind of counteracted by the fact that multiple major metropolitan cities have passed laws that allow for alternative foods to be served in schools, right? Pouring rights contracts don't have a monopoly on the economic market of food in schools, and I think you know that, right? So let's not do that either. It's either should we ban them, or does banning them make them worse, so we should find an alternative to make kids healthier? And I think at this point, your last 3 minutes kind of definitively proves that that we should do the latter. And I think you've made some major concessions in your last speech, right? The first concession you made is this pediatric study in which not just some, right, definitively the percentage of obesity, BMI, and lack of health, and it's not immediately after, right? I know you kind of tried to say like, well, you can't just study it right after. No, 3 years, right? If you ask any dietitian, how long should it take for someone to get healthy? I think they'd say somewhere underneath 3 years, right? You get healthy within 12 months and then you maintain. That's how health works. You don't just work on it forever indefinitely. It's not a Sisyphusian task. You get healthy and then you maintain it. A 3 or 4 year study after a ban, not only is it definitive, but it's enough to definitively prove that this is not the right route to go. And if it was the right route to go, I would like for you to provide me with some kind of counter argument or counter proposal after half an hour of why the Obama White House, Los Angeles, and New York all did not institute this policy and went the other way. I think the science of it bears out. People understand how our neurotransmitters work with regards to deeply embedded addictions. I think psychology proves that. I think that prohibition, nicotine bans, and sugar bans have all empirically proved in the last 6 decades, as well as quite clearly in the last decades, that these bans don't work, and that providing choice while providing alternatives and education, but no ban, the ban makes it worse, is genuinely the way to go here and genuinely the way to make kids healthy.
I'm going to let my opponent finish out his 10 seconds because it's not going to make sense to give him this speech after that.
No, I'm good. Go ahead. Thank you very much, though. I appreciate the concession.
Okay. Let's summarize this under 2 main arguments. The first is of statistical consolation. Now, my opponent has not consolidated or explained any of my stats. Here's the thing. He's focused only on his stat and said this has to be true and has ignored everything from the National Bureau of Economics, and and all the other studies that I listed too. And here's the thing: I can't really explain a study either. I'll be honest. There are hard questions and there's statistical variance that I can't answer. But what I can answer are the arguments that he's made about the other alternatives. He says this is not how debate works. Debate operates on mutual exclusivity. None of his suggestions are mutually exclusive. It's like saying, hey, we should pass this policy about economics. All right, counterplan, defeat ISIS. Guess what? You can defeat ISIS too, so it's not a reason to not do this. You can offer healthy alternatives too. So on all of his arguments, you can group them under and say the affirmative can also do that. So it's not a reason to reject the ban. The second argument is of critical solvency. Look, he's not remembering that pouring rights contracts don't exist in all schools, but most, and he can never offer alternatives.
I think if exclusivity was applicant here, the Obama White House, LA, and New York would have banned it.